This evening, we're going to be looking at one of the most famous stories recorded for us in biblical text. When you think of Daniel, typically you probably think of the image portrayed in several different children's books and children's Bibles, VBS stories of Daniel in the lion's den. Perhaps this is the most famous story found within the book of Daniel. If you remember in previous classes, we've looked at Daniel's chapter 1 through 5 so far. In Daniel chapter 1, we see that Daniel is one who is resolved not to defile himself by the king's food. And really, this gives us a pretty good insight into the character of Daniel. And when we look at the outline of Daniel, we see the man of Daniel in chapter 1. And we see that he's confident in God, that he's resolved himself for the purpose of staying faithful to God. And then in Daniel chapter 2, we see this King Nebuchadnezzar and his true colors kind of shine as he has this ornate dream. And he dreams of this statue, and no wise man or enchanter is able to interpret this dream. However, Daniel, being a man of God, is able to interpret the dream. And so Daniel interprets the dream in Daniel chapter 2. And in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, we get insight into this future kingdom that's going to take place. And how King Nebuchadnezzar is mainly just another stepping stone in the order of kingdoms in this world. And in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 21, we realize that it is God who raises kings up and lowers kings down. And so nations will come and they'll go, but God is the one who is truly in control. And then we got into Daniel chapter 3 and we saw Daniel kind of break away from the narrative from himself. And then we see these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And there was a fourth man among these three men who delivered them out of the fiery furnace because the king was upset that these three men of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not fall down and worship the golden statue that he created. And then in Daniel chapter 4, we get a second dream from King Nebuchadnezzar. And if you remember Daniel 4, I was in northwest Arkansas fighting off bugs, and there were flies swarming around and all sorts of other creatures on the ground. But in Daniel chapter 4, we looked at the pride of man and how C.S. Lewis says that pride is spiritual cancer and how pride will drive you to rock bottom, and it will guide you to a place that you don't want to go. Well, certainly King Nebuchadnezzar fell into this trap of pride, and he was one who became humbled. And some of the last words that King Nebuchadnezzar spit out of his mouth were the words of, God is able to humble those who walk in pride. And then we get into Daniel chapter 5, and this was where we have King Belshazzar. And King Belshazzar was one who, again, had this pride problem, came after King Nebuchadnezzar, and he got all the golden vessels out of the temple, including the cups and things of that nature, and how he started defiling them by having this grand party. And in this party, he started getting drunk, and then out of nowhere, thin air, a hand appeared and started writing on the wall. And we saw those different words and what they meant from Daniel as he interpreted those. And then that king also died. And in chapter 5 and verse 31, we see this new king, King Darius. Now, this is going to bring us into the Medo-Persian timeline. So there was Assyria, and Assyria had conquered Jerusalem and started taking people captive. And then Babylon conquered Assyria. And Babylon was this great and mighty nation until the Medo-Persians came in. And so now we're in this timeline of the Medo-Persians, and if you really wanted to look more into this, you could look at Isaiah 45 and kind of God's prophecy and God's vision for what was going to take place through his tool of Cyrus. And when we look at chapter 45 of Isaiah in verse 4, we realize that Cyrus was one who did not know God, but yet God was still going to use him anyways. That brings us into Daniel chapter 6 in tonight's study. And the main thing that I want us to understand in Daniel chapter 6 tonight is simply the idea that God is the one who delivers. Now, this may be somewhat of a cliche or stereotypical lesson that you'd find in the Bible as far as, we're in Bible class and the lesson tonight is the idea that God delivers. Again, kind of one of those no-brainer ideas. However, when we look more specifically at Daniel chapter 6, this will come to light even more so than the image of Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel in the lion's den is a really neat story for a couple of different reasons, and I'm excited to get into the lesson tonight, so let's just go ahead and jump into it. Daniel chapter 6 and verse 1, it says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom." Now, satraps are They could be defined as protectors of the kingdom or administrators. So they were kind of higher up officials, but those who had a job to protect the kingdom. So Darius is going to rise up on the scene after Belshazzar. And if you wanted to look even more scholarly into who Darius is, you may have difficulty finding Darius in secular history. So who is Darius? Some have believed that this is Gobrias. If you wanted to look that up, it's Gobryas. That name is a secondary name for someone who could be Darius. It was very common for people, especially Medo-Persians, to go by two different names. They would have their king name and they'd have their throne name. Or it could just be this Darius figure that we read of in biblical texts and nowhere else in secular history. But if you wanted to research more in depth, and this class is not meant to be a scholarly in-depth class, this class is meant to be a Wednesday night class. On top of that, it's being recorded and published through Facebook Publisher as well as YouTube. So I understand that attention spans aren't the greatest over video. So we're not going to get into a lot of the secular stuff, even though I would love to. If you wanted to research this more in depth, definitely check out the name Gobrias, and you will find some very interesting things. There were several different scholars who also believe that this is the man who is also named Darius. Anyways, that aside, we can continue further with our biblical text. Chapter 6 and verse 2, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. So here's the image that's being portrayed from Daniel chapter 1 all the way to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 1, Daniel's a nobody. He is lofty in appearance, and he sets his ways to God. He sets his mind to God and not to the king. And he's a Jewish exile. So he's living in a foreign land under a foreign culture. And by the time we get to Daniel chapter 6, he is now one of the top 3 officials over this foreign nation that is now Medo-Persian. So it's very interesting how God has been able to lift Daniel up and exalt him in order that Daniel may show the glory of God. And we'll get to that at the very end of Daniel chapter 6. But King Darius does not really recognize God all that much. He is, of course, a pagan worshiping king. But he does understand that Daniel is one who believes in God. Verse 3, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. Now, what is that excellent spirit that's in him? When we go back to Daniel chapter 5 and verse 11, it says, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Now again, Babylonian theology, there are multiple gods. However, they're still using the word holy to say that this God is set apart, even though they're still trying to rationalize in their mind a polytheism. Here in Daniel chapter 6, it says, because of his spirit, of the spirit that was in him. So that's kind of interesting. And because of the spirit, he was distinguished from all the rest. Would simply due to the fact that he was doing things that no one else was able to do. Again, one of the key words found in the book of Daniel is this word for able. It shows that God is able to do things that no one else is, and men of God are able to do things that no one else are able to do. Verse 4, then the high officials and satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel. Now, this is a very toxic pursuit, and sometimes I think we as the church fall victim to this pursuit. Notice how the text says that they sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel. I think sometimes we get into a situation where we see someone who is now being raised up, being exalted by other men who are recognized, and there's a little bit of jealousy that starts taking place. It's that pride that's a spiritual cancer that starts blooming within our hearts, and that causes us to start looking for grounds of complaint against someone else. Instead of seeing the best in someone, we start trying to find the worst. However, here's what's cool about Daniel. Daniel chapter 6 and verse 4, continuing on, it says, Daniel, with regard to the kingdom, but they could, that's our key word for able, they could not find a ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Man, that's an awesome statement there for a person of God. That no ground of complaint was able to be found against Daniel. Number one, because he was faithful. And number two, because when we look at verse 4, that no error or fault was found in him. It was simply the fact that Daniel had a reputation of being blameless. No one could find complaint or blame against Daniel. He lived his life as a pure person, and because of that, no one could find ground for complaint. Verse 5, then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless, that's the key word, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Now, that's the problem, is these people couldn't find a ground for complaint, so they're going to make one. That's obviously more of this toxic pursuit, that they're trying to find the evil in someone. They can't. And so what they're going to do is they're going to create a plan in order to kind of set Daniel in a position of guilt. When we jump down in the text at the end of verse 7, they basically go to King Darius and they set up this proposition and they say, hey, look, here's what we're going to do. You're going to sign this decree that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. And that's at the end of verse 7. So that's what they pitch to King Darius. And then in verse 8 it says, now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Verse 9 is where we really get into trouble. It says, therefore King Darius signed the document and injunction. So King Darius looked at it and he said, yeah, that looks good. Again, they don't have this theology of the Jews. And so he says, hey, if anyone's going to worship anyone else besides me for 30 days, they get chucked into the den of lions. Now, here's what's interesting, is there's obviously a relationship going on between King Darius and Daniel, because as soon as Darius finds out what's going to take place, what's going to take place against Daniel, King Darius becomes very upset. But notice Daniel's actions when he learns about this injunction or this decree that takes place. Verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, so he's very well aware that the law against him says, if you worship any god or man other than King Darius, that you'll be thrown into a den of lions. Notice what he does. He says, it went into his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. Now, so much could be said about that one verse in particular. Number 1, finding a place to pray. In Mark chapter 1, we realize that Jesus even finds places to isolate himself, to put himself away from other people so that he could spend time in prayer. Likewise, Daniel realized that there was a time and place for prayer to be away from everyone else. Certainly there's a time and place to pray with other people, but at this point in time, Daniel realized that he needed to spend some time in prayer alone. But also it says, as he had done previously. So Daniel was already doing this even before he was facing oppression. But then he got down on his knees. Not only is there a place to pray, but there also should be a position to pray. Now, sometimes you can pray while driving, you can pray while laying in bed, but there is a great benefit to getting down on your knees physically and bowing before God, before his throne, and praying to him. If we understand that God is a king, and it may seem silly in our minds as Western thinkers to say, man, I'm not going to get down on my knees and pray. You might think twice about that, because we see faithful men of God getting down on their knees and praying before God. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16, it is Christ who gives us the confidence to approach God's throne. When we look at the throne through images of Revelation chapter 4 or Ezekiel 1 and 10 or Isaiah chapter 6, we realize that this throne is intimidating to go before. And so appropriately, the proper position of going before the throne is on bended knee with its humiliation. Not with the pride of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4, but with humiliation, and that's what Daniel is doing. Not only is there a place of prayer or a position of prayer, but there is a posture of prayer and what Daniel was doing, and that is he was giving thanks toward God. Even though Daniel is about to be thrown into a den of lions, he's still finding ways to thank God. I think there's plenty of things that we can give thanks to God for, even amidst the crazy world that we're living today. And so we'll move on. That's just kind of one thing that really shows the man of Daniel and his character. Moving down through the text, in verse 14, basically the satraps and these higher officials go before the king and they say, look, we found fault against Daniel. He's praying before God. We saw him. He's in his chamber with the window open. And then the king has a response in verse 14. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. Now, put your finger there or circle the idea of deliver. Again, we're going to be looking at this idea of God delivers. So hold that in your mind. The king labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Verse 15, then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. So the king at this point, he's got this good relationship with Daniel. He's obviously a good friend to Daniel. Daniel is the one who is unique among the three different officials. And yet the king is trying to find loopholes through this whole conundrum to figure out how can Daniel escape the den of lions. Well, there is no loophole. That's the sad part. And so what happens here is the king tries to labor until the setting of sun. It just can't happen. And so in verse 16, the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. So the king is even recognizing at this point that Daniel is still faithful to God, that this God of Daniel must be worth serving because he's even willing to sacrifice his life in order to serve this God. And then a stone was brought in verse 17 and laid on the mouth of the den. And then in verse 18, then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. So the king couldn't sleep. He was on this fast because he was genuinely worried and distressed over the thought of Daniel being torn from limb to limb by these lions that he was thrown into because of his worship to God. Verse 19, then at the break of day, so it wasn't mid-afternoon, it wasn't evening, it was the break of day. As soon as he could, the king runs out to Daniel into the den of lions. And in verse 20, as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able, that's our key word for the book of Daniel, has he been able to deliver you from the lions? Now, I think it's really neat that King Darius is now giving Daniel a title or a position. He says, "O Daniel, servant of the living God." He realizes, even as a pagan king, he realizes that this God is living, that he's active. He's heard the stories of all the things before. Daniel obviously has a great reputation of beating the odds. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego escaped the odds, and there was a fourth man unbound with him in the fiery furnace. So obviously there's something taking place here that's pretty divine and pretty awesome in terms of supernatural work. Notice he says, "O servant of the living God." If we go back to chapter 5 and verse 11, the queen tells the king Belshazzar, she says, "There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy God." So people are starting to pick up that Daniel is unique. He's different because he has the God of the universe with him. And it's this living God. And then he says, "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you. O king, I have done no harm." So a couple things to look at here. It says, "My God sent his angel." Now, that's pretty cool because we start getting into this idea of a theophany. We'll dig more into that a little bit later. But basically, whenever you see a definite article in front of the angel of the Lord, you can kind of assume that this is a manifestation of Jesus before the incarnation of him. So Jesus was born in Matthew chapter 1 to a carnate body. That doesn't mean that he was created in Matthew chapter 1. Jesus has been living forever. And in John chapter 1, we realize that Jesus is the creator of the universe. And Paul would also back that up in Colossians chapter 1. You take both those chapters and you realize that Jesus is the author of the universe because Jesus is God. Well, what was Jesus doing before he was made manifest in the flesh? He was doing things like slaying the Assyrian camp. He was doing things like saving Daniel from the lion's den, that Daniel had an encounter with Jesus pre-manifestation of the flesh. And that's a pretty cool reality when you realize that, man, Daniel was in this lion's den, and of all people for God to send down there to help encourage and comfort Daniel, who did he send? He sent his son before the flesh incarnate manifestation of him. So that's pretty awesome. Verse 23, then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. If we can get this through our stubborn minds that God delivers and that no one else can deliver like God, then perhaps we can have more trust in him for whenever we face different challenges in this life. That it is simply God who provides and it is God who delivers like no one else in this world. Now, this is typically where the VBS story ends as far as, okay, Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, an angel comes and delivers him, shuts the mouths of the lions, and then Daniel gets brought up, and then the king is exceedingly glad. But that's not all. Kind of like those commercials. There's still more to come. And then the king commanded, and those men who had been maliciously accusing Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. Now, this is where we kind of break away from the VBS story because we don't want to have this material out there to disturb the children's minds. But they, the people who maliciously accused Daniel, their children and their wives, and before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. So that was quite a sight. The lions were sitting there. They were kind of getting teased by Daniel, and they were hungry. And so all of a sudden, these new people coming in, and the angel of the Lord is no longer there protecting them. So that's the end of their story. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all the peoples and nations and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree. So this is his second decree, and maybe he's learning something. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Jesus tells us the same thing in Matthew chapter 28 through 30 as far as don't fear man who can destroy just the body, but fear God who can destroy both the body and the soul in hell. It is so much more than just a respect, but it is a trembling, a fear, just as King Darius has been promoting for all the earth. And then King Darius kind of breaks down into somewhat of a praise for God. For he is the living God. We had that idea earlier up here in verse 20. Yeah, in verse 20. O Daniel, servant of the living God. Trace that back down here to 26. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. Notice how that ties directly back to Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, that in those days, Daniel is praising God, in those days there shall be a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Well, King Darius would also agree with that. Verse 27, he delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, he who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Now, in verse 27, he says, he delivers. Notice what King Darius was trying to do in verse 14. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. If you remember King Darius earlier, he was trying to deliver Daniel out of this, but he couldn't. He didn't have the ability. There was no capacity of King Darius at this point to go back on his word. And he tried until the day was over, and then he fasted all night long, and he couldn't sleep. And then in verse 27 of Daniel chapter 6, he finally admits that God is the one who can deliver. And so King Darius goes from this point of trying to deliver to realizing that it is God who delivers. And Daniel knew that all along. That's why he trusted God. Verse 28 is kind of where we get the end of Daniel chapter 6. It says, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And that's where we connect to Isaiah chapter 45, as Cyrus is going to be this tool in God's hand. So again, awesome things from Daniel chapter 6. I'm so glad that you tuned in with us. Again, the main point of Daniel 6 is simply the fact that God delivers. That we may try to deliver ourselves, we may try to deliver other people. But I think the best option for when looking at deliverance, true deliverance that is simply to follow an example of Daniel, and that is praying, thanking God, and spending time with God, and having confidence that He will deliver us. Even not if in this life, then certainly the attitude of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 4, that even if not, we're still not going to bow down to the gods of this world, but we're going to continue on and live with God forever. Because, according to King Darius and Daniel, that kingdom is one that shall endure forever. Thank you again for tuning in with us. Hopefully you gleaned something from Daniel chapter 6.